deeply aware of this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed.
Buckingham Palace has said King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today after experiencing the temporary side effects of his cancer.
They said it would never happen. They promised he would fight to the end. But 5 minutes ago, palace insiders leaked something absolutely devastating. King Charles's abdication date has been confirmed, and when you hear when it is, your jaw will drop. What they found in his private chambers left the staff in tears. The real reason he is walking away will break your heart. Princess Anne tried to warn him, but it was already too late. When the official statement was released, it lasted barely 3 minutes. Yet those few minutes managed to accomplish what months of speculation and rumor had failed to do. They brought absolute clarity to a question that had haunted the British monarchy since King Charles first assumed the throne. The words were measured, carefully chosen, and delivered with the kind of restraint that only centuries of royal protocol can produce. But beneath that measured tone lay an announcement that would reverberate across not just Britain, but the entire Commonwealth and beyond. The briefing room where the announcement took place had hosted countless press conferences over the years. Royal correspondents who had covered the monarchy for decades filled the seats, their notebooks ready, their cameras positioned. They had gathered expecting important news, certainly, but few were prepared for the magnitude of what they were about to hear. As the palace spokesperson began to speak, a collective stillness descended upon the room. Pens that had been poised to write remained motionless. Cameras continued to roll, but the photographers behind them seemed frozen in place. The statement confirmed what many had feared, but few had dared to voice publicly. A date had been set. King Charles, the man who had waited longer than any heir in British history to wear the crown, had made his decision about when he would step away from it. The announcement did not come with elaborate explanation or emotional justification. It simply stated the facts with the kind of dignified brevity that has become synonymous with royal communication. His Majesty had reached a final decision regarding the timeline of his abdication. Those words, spoken with deliberate calm, cut through months of uncertainty like a blade through silk. This was not a trial balloon being floated to gauge public reaction. This was not a rumor that could be dismissed or a story that could be walked back. This was final, official, and irreversible. The palace, an institution that typically moves with glacial slowness when it comes to major announcements, had spoken with unusual decisiveness. The decision had been made, the date had been chosen, and the wheels of one of the most significant royal transitions in modern history had been set in motion. Veteran journalists who had spent years, sometimes decades, covering the royal family later described the atmosphere in that briefing room as unlike anything they had experienced before. One correspondent with over 30 years of experience covering royalty said it felt less like a standard press briefing and more like witnessing a turning point in history unfold in real time. The usual flurry of immediate questions that typically follows major announcements was notably absent. Instead, there was a moment of collective processing, as if everyone in the room needed a few extra seconds to fully absorb what they had just heard. The palace aides who stood at the edges of the room, ever professional and disciplined, could not entirely mask their own emotions. Some appeared pale, their faces betraying the stress of keeping such a monumental secret. Others looked visibly emotional, though their training prevented any dramatic displays. One journalist described seeing an aide whose jaw was clenched so tightly that it seemed as though they were physically holding back tears. These were people who had dedicated their careers to serving the crown, and now they were witnessing the beginning of the end of a reign they had worked so hard to support. As the briefing concluded and the media representatives began to file out, a low hum of urgent conversation filled the corridors. Reporters rushed to file their stories, knowing that within minutes, this news would circle the globe. Photographers reviewed their images, searching for any frame that might capture the weight of the moment. Outside the palace gates, word spread with remarkable speed. Within an hour, a crowd had begun to gather, not organized by any particular group or movement, but drawn together by the shared human impulse to be present at moments of historical significance. The crowd that assembled was notable for what it was not. This was not a celebration, nor was it a protest. People stood in small clusters, talking quietly among themselves, united by a sense of stunned disbelief. Some held phones to their ears, calling family members or friends to share the news. Others simply stood in silence, staring up at the palace windows as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something that might help them make sense of what they had just learned. The mood was somber, reflective, and heavy with the realization that the nation was entering uncharted territory. Behind the carefully crafted announcement lay layers of complexity that would only become clear in the days and weeks that followed. The date itself, while announced, was immediately the subject of intense speculation. Royal historians and commentators began analyzing potential significance, searching for connections to important anniversaries or meaningful moments in royal history. Some suggested the chosen day might align with coronation anniversaries, while others pointed to personal family milestones. The palace, true to form, offered no additional explanation, leaving the public to wonder and debate. Perhaps the most striking revelation that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the announcement was how closely the secret had been guarded. According to sources close to the royal household, even senior members of the royal family had been informed only hours before the public statement was released. This was highly unusual for an institution that typically operates on carefully orchestrated timelines, where key stakeholders are brought into the loop well in advance. The abruptness of the notifications sent ripples of shock through even the most seasoned members of the court. Several prominent royals reportedly received the news through hastily arranged phone calls earlier that same day. The conversations were brief, direct, and left little room for discussion or debate. This departure from normal protocol suggested a level of urgency and finality that caught many off guard. Royal insiders described the decision as sharp and decisive, characteristics not typically associated with a monarch known for careful deliberation and lengthy consultation. It appeared that Charles, after what must have been considerable personal reflection, had chosen to act swiftly once his mind was made up. The palace had managed to achieve something it rarely does in the modern age of instant communication and relentless media scrutiny. It had kept a secret of monumental importance under wraps until the precise moment it chose to reveal it. In doing so, it had stunned not just the media and the public, but the monarchy itself. The confirmation of the abdication date was not simply an announcement. It was a signal that the transition had already begun behind closed doors, that decisions had been made in quiet rooms away from public view, and that what the world was now witnessing was merely the public unveiling of a plan that had been developing for some time. The royal family, the government, and the nation as a whole were no longer dealing with hypotheticals or distant possibilities. The countdown had started. From this moment forward, every day would bring them closer to a historic moment when one king would step down and another would rise to take his place. To understand why King Charles arrived at this momentous decision, it becomes necessary to look beyond the ceremonial facade and examine the weight of a crown he had pursued for the better part of his life, only to discover it was far heavier than anyone could have imagined. Behind the carefully maintained public image of stability and duty, there existed a private reality marked by exhaustion, mounting health concerns, and the quiet acknowledgement that time had played a cruel trick on a man who had waited so long for his moment. For more than 70 years, Charles had lived in what can only be described as a state of perpetual waiting. His mother's reign stretched across decades, making his wait for the throne the longest in the entire history of the British monarchy. During those years, he had prepared, studied, and shaped himself into what he believed a modern monarch should be. He had developed passions for architecture, environmental causes, and organic farming. He had spoken out on issues that mattered to him, sometimes courting controversy in the process. Through it all, the crown remained just beyond his reach, a destiny that was certain yet perpetually delayed. When the crown finally did rest upon his head following the death of Queen Elizabeth, the moment arrived wrapped in grief and national mourning. The circumstances of his accession were far from the triumphant occasion he might have envisioned during his younger years. Instead, he inherited the throne at an age when most people are well into retirement, taking on responsibilities that would challenge someone half his age. The contrast between the decades spent waiting and the brevity of what would become his reign created a profound irony that was not lost on observers both inside and outside the palace walls. What should have marked the beginning of a triumphant new era instead became a relentless test of endurance. The demands of modern monarchy are extraordinarily taxing, requiring not just ceremonial presence, but active engagement with political leaders, diplomatic representatives, and countless organizations and charities. The schedule of a reigning monarch is grueling, filled with early morning briefings, afternoon engagements, evening receptions, and late-night paperwork. For a younger person, such demands are challenging. For someone who had already lived 7 decades, they proved increasingly overwhelming. Behind the grandeur and the public appearances, Charles's health began to show signs of strain. This was not a sudden collapse or a dramatic health crisis that could be pointed to as a clear turning point. Instead, it was a gradual decline, the kind that creeps up slowly and steadily, noticed first by those closest to the person experiencing it. Private physicians who attended to the king expressed their concerns in hushed, careful tones, aware that their observations carried implications far beyond simple medical advice. They watched as the cumulative effect of age, stress, and responsibility began to take its toll. Palace aides, whose job requires them to be acutely observant of their employer's condition, began to notice subtle changes. The king seemed more fatigued after public engagements than he had been even a year earlier. Recovery time between events grew longer. There were moments of unusual silence, periods where Charles seemed to retreat inward, processing burdens that he shared with no one. Close friends and family members observed a man who was slowly but unmistakably withdrawing from the relentless pace that the role demanded. These were not the kinds of observations that made their way into official reports or medical bulletins, but they were real nonetheless. The pressure to maintain a constant public presence, to embody stability in an increasingly turbulent world, began to exact a price that even the most dedicated monarch could not pay indefinitely. Those who study the monarchy understand that the role requires a kind of stamina that goes beyond physical health. It demands emotional resilience, mental sharpness, and an almost superhuman ability to remain composed under scrutiny. Charles had all of these qualities, but they were being tested in ways that age only makes more difficult. Inside the palace, shifts began to occur long before the public had any sense that something was amiss. Key engagements that Charles would have naturally led started to be quietly delegated to other members of the royal family. At first, these changes could be explained away as practical distribution of responsibilities. The royal family has always operated as a team, with different members taking on different roles and events. But to those who watched closely, the pattern became clear. This was not simply about efficient delegation. This was the beginning of a transition. Catherine and William began appearing at more and more prominent events. Their presence at major state occasions increased with each passing season. They were not simply attending as supporting members of the family. They were beginning to occupy the spaces that traditionally belonged to the sovereign. The public saw a younger, energetic couple stepping forward, and many interpreted this as a natural evolution of royal duties. But within palace circles, it was understood as something more significant. This was preparation, a careful rehearsal for a future that was approaching faster than most realized. Charles himself began to step back in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to those who worked closely with him. Decisions that he would once have made personally were increasingly left to trusted staff members. His involvement in the intricate details of royal affairs, once meticulous and comprehensive, began to thin. Meetings that would have stretched late into the evening were cut short or delegated entirely. This was not the behavior of a monarch who was lazy or disengaged. Rather, It was the response of someone whose energy reserves were finite and depleting. Those who had known Charles for years spoke in private conversations of a change they had never expected to see. The man who had spent his entire life preparing for kingship, who had opinions and passions about how the monarchy should function in the modern world, now seemed to be looking inward rather than forward. He appeared to be engaged in a kind of internal reckoning, questioning not his legacy or his accomplishments, but something more fundamental. He was questioning whether he had the strength to continue. An invisible battle had developed within him, one between the duty that had been drilled into him since childhood and the very human need for self-preservation. Charles had been raised according to the principle that the crown must always come before the individual. Service to the nation was paramount. Personal comfort, personal desires, even personal health were secondary to the responsibilities of the throne. These were not just abstract concepts, but deeply ingrained beliefs that had shaped his entire worldview. Yet now, perhaps for the first time in his life, the man beneath the crown was questioning whether that principle could hold. His body was sending signals that could not be ignored. His mind, still sharp but weary, was recognizing limits that duty alone could not overcome. The monarch who had represented patience and perseverance throughout his long wait was now facing a different kind of challenge entirely. He had waited too long to rule, and the role itself was consuming what remained of his vitality at a pace that frightened those who cared about him. Late at night, when the palace grew quiet and the demands of the day receded, Charles found himself confronting questions that no amount of preparation had equipped him to answer. How much more could he reasonably give? At what point did perseverance become stubborn denial of reality? When did duty transform from noble sacrifice into something that served no one, least of all the institution he was trying to protect? These were not questions that could be resolved through consultation with advisors or study of historical precedent. They required a kind of honesty with oneself that is difficult under any circumstances, and nearly impossible when the entire weight of tradition and expectation rests on one's shoulders. The palace, with its long corridors and countless rooms, had witnessed many personal struggles throughout its history. But this particular struggle, happening within a king who had waited so long and sacrificed so much for the role, carried a poignancy that was difficult to ignore. Charles was discovering what few monarchs before him had been forced to confront in such stark terms. Sometimes the greatest act of service is knowing when to step aside. While Charles wrestled privately with the weight of his position, forces around him were already in motion. Some acted out of genuine loyalty and concern for the monarchy's future. Others were driven by the age-old currents of ambition and self-preservation that have always flowed through royal courts. In the midst of this complex web of motivations and relationships, a conversation took place that would prove pivotal in pushing Charles toward his final decision. The setting was Balmoral, the Scottish estate that has long served as a private retreat for the royal family. Away from the formality of Buckingham Palace and the constant scrutiny of London, Balmoral offers a rare opportunity for candid conversation. It was here that Princess Anne, Charles's sister, and one of his most trusted confidants, confronted him with words that would cut through any remaining illusions he might have held about his situation. Her message was simple but devastating. They are preparing for a throne without you. Anne had never been one to soften difficult truths or wrap uncomfortable realities in diplomatic language. Throughout her life, she had built a reputation as perhaps the most straightforward member of the royal family, someone who valued practicality and honesty above courtly politeness. Her relationship with Charles was not based on political calculation, but forged over decades of shared experience as the two eldest children of a long-reigning monarch. They understood each other in ways that others could not, having both lived their entire lives in the unique pressure cooker of royal duty. This deep bond between siblings made her words carry even more weight. Anne was not delivering a threat or engaging in palace intrigue. She was offering a warning born from observation and genuine concern. In the months leading up to this conversation, she had begun to notice subtle but unmistakable signs that loyalty within the palace was shifting. It was not one dramatic betrayal or obvious power grab. Rather, it was a series of small adjustments, quiet redirections, and carefully calibrated changes in behavior among those who worked closest to the throne. Senior courtiers who had spent years, sometimes entire careers, serving Charles had begun to subtly alter their focus. Anne observed how conversations that once would have centered entirely on the king's schedule and priorities now increasingly involved discussions about the Prince and Princess of Wales. Invitations to key meetings were being extended differently. Briefings that Charles would have automatically received were sometimes delivered to William first. The language used in internal communications had begun to shift, with phrases like "when the transition occurs" becoming more common than "if there is a transition." These changes were not happening in isolation. They reflected a broader understanding among those who worked within the palace that the future was arriving sooner than official timelines suggested. Palace staff, by necessity and by training, are experts at reading the currents of power. They understand that their careers and their effectiveness depend on being aligned with whoever holds or will hold authority. What Anne had observed was the natural but unsettling phenomenon of an institution beginning to reorient itself toward a new center of gravity. When she confronted Charles with these observations, her tone carried both urgency and genuine sorrow. She understood what this meant for her brother, both personally and historically. She urged him to recognize that if he did not take control of his own departure, if he did not define the terms and timing himself, then circumstances and other people would eventually force his hand. The choice, she told him, was not whether he would step down, but whether he would do so with dignity and agency, or be pushed into it by events beyond his control. Her words struck at the heart of something Charles feared. The idea that his reign might end not through his own decision, but through a gradual erosion of authority, was deeply troubling. Anne made clear that this was not about anyone actively plotting against him. It was simply the reality of how institutions function when they sense that leadership is weakening. The monarchy had survived for centuries by being adaptable, by anticipating change rather than being overwhelmed by it. That same survival instinct was now manifesting in preparations for a post-Charles era, whether he was ready for it or not. Behind the palace gates, the influence of William and Catherine was expanding in ways that could no longer be dismissed as routine delegation of duties. Courtiers who possess the kind of institutional knowledge and connections that make them invaluable were increasingly aligning themselves with the future rather than the present. This was not treachery in any conventional sense. These were professionals doing what they believed was best for the monarchy as an institution. But the effect was unmistakable. William's briefings grew longer and more detailed. His input on matters of state and ceremony was sought more frequently. Catherine's schedule began to mirror that of a queen in waiting, with engagements carefully chosen to build her profile and demonstrate her readiness. The senior staff who managed the daily operations of the monarchy were playing strategic games of their own. These were not overt coups or dramatic power plays. They were the subtle maneuvers that happen in any large organization when leadership transition appears on the horizon. Information was shared selectively. Schedules were arranged with an eye toward positioning certain people for prominence. Whispers in corridors shaped perceptions long before official announcements confirmed them. The machinery of succession, which had always existed as a theoretical framework, was beginning to operate in practice. Anne's warning to Charles included specific examples of these shifts. She pointed to instances where decisions about royal engagements had been made without his direct input, something that would have been unthinkable even a year earlier. She noted how certain senior advisors had begun offering suggestions about how William might handle various situations, speaking about him as if his ascension was imminent rather than theoretical. She observed that the tone of internal communications had changed, with language that increasingly treated the current reign as a brief interlude rather than an enduring era. What made Anne's intervention so powerful was that it came not from political calculation, but from genuine sisterly concern. She knew her brother had spent his entire life preparing for the role of king. She understood how much he had sacrificed and how deeply he cared about the institution. But she also recognized, perhaps more clearly than Charles himself, that the circumstances had become untenable. Her plea to him was not to let others write the final chapter of his reign. If the ending was inevitable, he should be the one to determine its terms. Charles listened to his sister with the kind of attention that only comes when someone you trust completely delivers a truth you have been avoiding. The conversation at Balmoral did not immediately resolve his internal struggle, but it served as a crucial catalyst. Anne had illuminated the fault lines that were developing within the palace, making visible what had been happening in shadows and side conversations. She had given name to the anxiety he had felt, but not fully articulated. In the days and weeks that followed this conversation, Charles began to look at his situation with new clarity. He observed the patterns Anne had described and recognized their accuracy. He saw how meetings unfolded, how decisions were presented to him, how his own authority was being gently but steadily circumvented in the name of efficiency and forward planning. The realization was not bitter exactly, but it was sobering. The institution he had devoted his life to serving was already preparing for his departure, whether he officially sanctioned it or not. The warning Anne delivered was more than just information about palace dynamics. It was a spark that illuminated the entire landscape of his situation. While the world saw a king carrying out his duties with traditional dignity, those inside the palace walls saw something different. They saw a transition already underway, a slow-motion transfer of power that had begun without formal announcement or public acknowledgement. Prince William, raised from birth to eventually wear the crown, found himself in an increasingly complex position, bound by loyalty to his father, yet unable to ignore the expectations building around him. Every public appearance William made became more than just another royal engagement. Each speech was analyzed not just for its immediate content, but for what it might reveal about his readiness to lead. Diplomatic tours that he undertook were scrutinized as auditions for kingship. State visits became opportunities for foreign leaders and their advisors to assess the future of the British monarchy. Behind palace doors, senior advisors had begun treating William not as the heir, but as the incoming sovereign, a subtle but significant shift in perspective that shaped everything from briefing materials to strategic planning. The process of selecting the abdication date unfolded with a level of secrecy that would have impressed intelligence agencies. In private meetings attended only by the most trusted palace advisors, discussions took on an intensity rarely seen even in an institution accustomed to dealing with matters of enormous significance. This was not simply about finding a convenient slot in the royal calendar or coordinating schedules with Parliament and the Church. The date itself would become part of the historical record, analyzed and debated by scholars for generations to come. Every option carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond practical considerations. Charles, ever conscious of the monarchy's role as the living embodiment of national history, understood that the choice of date would send a message. It would be interpreted, analyzed, and imbued with meaning whether he intended it or not. Therefore, the selection process became an exercise in balancing multiple considerations. Advisors presented various options, each tied to significant moments in royal history or personal milestones that might give the decision additional resonance. Some suggested dates connected to Queen Elizabeth's reign, arguing that aligning the abdication with an anniversary of her accession would create a sense of continuity and tribute. Others advocated for dates that held personal significance for Charles himself, moments from his own life that would give his departure a more intimate quality. The discussions were conducted in rooms where electronic devices were prohibited, and attendance was strictly limited. Notes were taken by hand and later secured in locked safes. The level of precaution reflected not paranoia, but an understanding that premature revelation of the date could trigger market instability, political complications, and media frenzy that would overshadow the carefully planned transition. As various dates were proposed and debated, Charles remained characteristically quiet, listening intently, but offering little immediate reaction. Those present described him as weighing not just the political and ceremonial implications, but the emotional resonance of each option. The chosen date, when it finally emerged from these deliberations, did so with what witnesses described as a sense of quiet inevitability. The moment of decision in that secure room felt almost ceremonial in itself, as if everyone present understood they were participating in something that would be studied and discussed long after they were gone. A single stroke of the pen confirmed the selection, transforming an abstract possibility into concrete reality. From that moment forward, the abdication was no longer a theoretical concept, but an approaching event with a fixed position in time. Only a handful of individuals knew the date initially, bound by oaths of confidentiality that they understood carried implications far beyond their own careers. Once the date was set, preparations began in earnest, but under conditions of near total secrecy. The palace formed a discreet task force whose very existence was known to only a few dozen people across the entire royal household. Legal teams began the painstaking work of reviewing precedents, some dating back centuries, to ensure that every constitutional requirement would be met. The last voluntary abdication in British history had occurred in circumstances so different that it provided limited practical guidance. This meant that much of the legal framework had to be carefully constructed from general principles rather than specific precedent. Ceremonial planners face their own unique challenges. How does one stage an event that combines the solemnity of an ending with the hope of a new beginning? What traditions should be honored? And what new elements might be necessary for an occasion without modern parallel? Security teams prepared for what they knew would be unprecedented global media attention. Estimates suggested that billions of people worldwide would watch the proceedings, requiring coordination with law enforcement agencies, intelligence services, and diplomatic missions across multiple countries. Every department involved in the preparation worked under strict instructions regarding confidentiality. Information was compartmentalized so that most people working on various aspects of the transition had no idea what others were doing, or even that their own work was connected to such a momentous event. This approach minimized the risk of leaks, but created its own challenges as coordination became more difficult when the usual channels of communication had to be severely restricted. As preparations accelerated in secret, the emotional weight of the approaching date began to affect those who knew about it. Senior royals who had been kept in the dark during the initial planning phase were eventually informed, one by one, in private meetings. Their reactions varied considerably. Some received the news with quiet acceptance, having perhaps sensed that events were moving in this direction. Others responded with visible shock, the reality of hearing a specific date making abstract concerns suddenly concrete. For a few, the notification triggered complicated emotions about their own futures and positions within a monarchy that was about to undergo its most significant transformation in generations. Family dynamics grew increasingly complex as more people were brought into the circle of knowledge. Those who knew the date found themselves carrying a burden that affected every interaction with those still unaware. Conversations became exercises in careful deflection. Casual questions about future plans took on unexpected weight. The strain of maintaining secrecy while preparing emotionally for what was coming created an atmosphere of tension that was difficult to entirely conceal, even with the royal family's well-practiced public composure. When the palace's official statement finally reached the public, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Britain, a nation that prides itself on stoicism and measured response, found itself genuinely shaken. The announcement dominated every news outlet within minutes. Television networks interrupted regular programming. Radio stations abandoned their scheduled content. Newspapers began preparing special editions, even though the news had broken electronically. The statement itself was brief and formal, but its implications were vast enough to occupy commentators, historians, and ordinary citizens for days. Crowds began gathering outside royal residences, not in organized fashion, but through spontaneous collective impulse. People wanted to be present, to mark the moment in some physical way, even if they could not articulate exactly why. The gatherings were notable for their subdued character. There was no celebration, but neither was there protest or anger. Instead, a kind of collective processing took place, strangers talking quietly with one another about what this meant for the nation and for their own sense of continuity. The emotional response across the United Kingdom was complex and multifaceted. Elderly citizens who had known only two monarchs in their entire lives found themselves facing a third transition, this one completely unprecedented in their experience. Charles had been a constant presence throughout their lives, first as heir and briefly as king. The thought of his voluntary departure stirred feelings that combined respect for his decision with anxiety about change. Younger generations, more accustomed to rapid shifts in leadership and less attached to traditional structures, nonetheless found themselves moved by the gravity of the moment. Even those who had been critical of the monarchy or indifferent to royal affairs recognized that they were witnessing something historically significant. Social media platforms became spaces for collective emotional expression on a scale rarely seen. Messages ranged from heartfelt tributes to analytical commentary to simple expressions of shock. The volume of conversation was so intense that it overwhelmed algorithms designed to identify trending topics. Within hours, the abdication announcement had generated more online discussion than any royal event since the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. Traditional media struggled to keep pace with the speed at which information, speculation, and emotion were circulating through digital channels. News organizations worldwide deployed their most experienced royal correspondents and constitutional experts to provide context and analysis. Broadcast coverage took on the character of a major historical event, with anchors adopting the measured, serious tones typically reserved for state funerals or national emergencies. Documentaries about Charles's life and reign were hastily assembled from archival footage. Historians were brought into studios to explain the constitutional implications and place the abdication within the broader sweep of British history. The global nature of the coverage reflected not just interest in Britain specifically, but recognition that the British monarchy, despite its reduced political power, still held symbolic significance far beyond the United Kingdom's borders. Political leaders across the spectrum faced the delicate task of responding to news that was simultaneously personal, constitutional, and deeply symbolic. From the Prime Minister to opposition leaders to representatives of devolved governments in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, carefully crafted statements began to emerge. The language had to strike an almost impossible balance, honoring Charles's service and acknowledging the significance of his decision, while also expressing confidence in the transition and in William's readiness to assume the throne. Behind the public statements, emergency meetings were convened to discuss the practical implications for government operations, diplomatic relations, and the countless ways in which the monarchy intersects with the functioning of the British state. International reaction came swiftly from governments and royal houses around the world. Messages of support arrived from allied nations, many noting the courage required to make such a decision. Other monarchies, particularly those in Europe with their own succession considerations, watched with intense interest. The British abdication would inevitably influence conversations in other royal households about age, duty, and the appropriate moment for generational transition. For republics, the event provided an opportunity to reflect on different models of leadership succession and the unique challenges faced by hereditary systems. Amid all the official responses and media coverage, a powerful wave of nostalgia swept across Britain. Television networks began airing retrospectives of Charles's life, from childhood photographs to his investiture as Prince of Wales to his coronation. Each image represented not just his personal journey, but moments in the lives of viewers who had grown up alongside him. The archival footage served as a reminder of how much had changed during his lifetime, and how he himself had evolved from a young man struggling to find his role to a king, making the extraordinarily difficult decision to step aside.